Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Allahumma salli wa sallim wa barakallah Sayyidina Muhammad fi kulli lamhatin wa nafasin adadama wa Allah. We've been kindly invited by Basmala Australia to speak about the history of Ramadan in Australia. This illustrious month and the practices that go along with it are quite extensive, and the history in Australia is deeper than many people would be aware. And we hope that through tonight's talk, something of this history can be known. So on Thursday, November 30, 1939, the Gippsland Times wrote, "The Mohammedan Christian Christmas festival was held on November 13th. There are not many of them in the district, but there are a few. Commencing last month, Ramadan had been previously observed by the Mohammedans in the state, prohibiting the partaking of food or drink or any worldly delights between the hours of sunrise and sunset. The fast entails an adherence to 5 prayers daily. For it was during Ramadan that the faithful believed that their prophet flew to Allah and communed with him in heaven. It is at this time of the Mohammedan year that the rich are expected to make their pilgrimage to Mecca, and the month of fasting ends with the sighting of the new moon." Now, in such a short newspaper article, there are multiple errors. The celebrations of Eid within the Islamic calendar coincide with the end of the month of Ramadan, the 9th Islamic month, and with the end of the pilgrimage period in Dhul Hijjah, the 12th Islamic month. Neither of these celebrations share anything with the meaning of Christmas. While the month of fasting does prohibit worldly delights during the daylight hours, the 5 daily prayers are a requirement for Muslims throughout the year. The reference to the night journey and ascension, Al-Isra wa Almiraj, when the Prophet flew to Allah and communed with him in heaven, occurred on the 27th night of Rajab, the 7th Islamic month. It is almost expected that such a conflation of errors of Islamic events and beliefs in one article would be typical of newspaper articles mentioning Islam during the period. However, a survey of Australia's print media between the 1880s and 1940 shows such an amalgamation of errors in one article to be an exception rather than a rule. Aside from recurrent references to Mohammedan Christmas and the occasional error, Australia's early print media regularly and accurately reports on Islamic celebrations across the country, highlighting the beliefs, practices, and legal rulings that led to and govern such festivities. Reports on Eid celebrations within Australia's early print media predominantly list the celebrations as Mohammedan Christmas, Islamic New Year, or, to a lesser extent, the Prophet's birthday. For instance, the sound of the joyful tom-tom mingled with the creak and clank of commerce at the Geelong waterside yesterday because it was the Christmas day of the Mohammedans. They were Mohammedans, 18 in number, who gathered together for the first time in Ballarat to celebrate that with which Christmas is known to Christians. Having concluded a month's fast, the Mohammedans of the district, chiefly from the Punjab, celebrated their Christmas yesterday. A Lismore paper reports that Mohammedan Christmas was observed in the district recently. It became so common that many of the Australian Muslims of the period themselves referred to the celebration as Christmas. As one newspaper reports, one of them, when questioned, said the performance was in celebration of the end of the fast over Christmas. Amongst the early reports of the celebration of Eid al-Fitr occurs in the Ballarat Courier in 1884. More than just a description of the Mohammedan festival, the newspaper reports provide some context stating, "The feast is always preceded by a 30 days fast, during which time Mohammedans do not eat from sunrise to sunset. So strict are they that they do not even drink water or smoke during the part of the day set apart for fasting." This sets up a somewhat surprisingly comprehensive collection of reports within Australia's early print media detailing the Islamic practice of fasting, the requirements of the fast, the beginning and end of the month, and the requirements for the celebration. In combination, these early media reports are so comprehensive that they are almost sufficient to reconstruct the jurisprudence of the month of Ramadan. Despite the reports including a mixture of fact and error, it is interesting to note the accuracy and inclusion of traditional sources within the early newspaper articles. Most simply put, regarding the fast, for the past month they have eaten only before dawn and after dusk, their faith decreeing that nothing shall enter their lips while the sun is visible. Such comprehensive simplicity is also contrasted in greater detail with one 1902 report stating, "In the month of Ramadan, Muhammad received his first revelation, and every believer is therefore required to keep a strict fast throughout its entire course, from dawn, when a white thread can be distinguished from a black thread, to sunset. Eating, drinking, smoking, bathing, smelling perfumes, and other bodily enjoyments, even swallowing one's spittle, are strictly prohibited during that period. Even when obliged to take medicine, the Muslim must make some kind of amends for it, such as spending a certain sum of money upon the poor. During the night, however, the most necessary wants may be satisfied, a permission practically which is interpreted by a profuse indulgence in all sorts of enjoyments." In a paragraph such as this, there is a lot to unpack. It is recorded that it was during the month of Ramadan that the Prophet Muhammad (SAW) first received the revelation of the Quran. However, the impetus to fast is made in the Quran as being part of previous revelations and to be included within Islamic practice, though without drawing a specific correlation between the revealing of the Quran and the month of fasting, stating, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, "O ye who believe, fasting is prescribed for you as it was prescribed for those before you, that ye may learn self-restraint." This is acknowledged in other reports which make reference to the law laid down in Quran, Surah 2, verses 79 to 179 to 184. The list of prohibitions during the fast are mostly accurate, with some schools of Islamic thought stating that it is disallowed to swallow one's saliva before a polluted mouth is washed, or any substance like phlegm that comes from beyond the throat. Even the exemptions for fasting for the sick and the amends are mentioned, without which is further expanded upon in a later 1912 article stating, "The sick and those on a journey might be excused, but should fast thereafter an equivalent number of days." Recalling the Quranic passage, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, "Fasting for a fixed number of days, but if any of you is ill or on a journey, the prescribed number should be made up from later days." It was recognized that making up the fast was not the only form of atonement. With the unexpected breaking of the fast might be atoned for by feeding of the poor. The beginning of the fast each day is marked by the ability to distinguish the black thread from the white thread, which is based on the Quranic passage, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. "Eat and drink until the white thread of dawn appear to you distinct from its black thread. Then complete your fast till the night appears." Reference to which is oft repeated in reports between 1892 and 1928 on fasting during the month of Ramadan. The requirements for the start and end of the month of Ramadan are also reported on, as the fast begins with a new moon, or more specifically, it was to begin when the new moon was actually seen and last until sight of the next new moon. Acknowledging the difficulty of this in practice, it was reported in 1913 that should the weather conditions be unfavourable and the moon obscured, they will fast again tomorrow and renew their vigil in the evening. Though once 30 days of fasting are completed, on the following day they will celebrate the conclusion of the fast with rejoicings and special religious services. There's even an instance of a fruitless vigil being reported in 1913, with the Mohammedan residents of Melbourne watching in vain last night for the appearance of the new moon, with a clouded sky and unsatisfactory weather conditions generally interfering with their observations. Even the transition from the traditional method of visual confirmation to the new moon to the calculation method was reported in 1928, stating, "For nearly 1,300 years, Muslims have watched the skies for the coming moon of Ramadan. And this year, for the first time in all the long history of this faith, ancient custom has been abandoned, and the time for the fast's beginning was scientifically calculated, and no observer had run reporting the appearance of the sickle in the heavens." There was even an awareness that the identification of the lunar month posed an additional challenge as it cycles through the solar calendar. Initial reports do not seem to show an explicit awareness of the extent of the movement of the Islamic calendar, stating, "The Christmas is a movable feast, being the first day after seeing the new moon in February," though it is later recognized that the beginning of these years evidently retrogrades rapidly through the seasons. These reports indicate an awareness of both the Islamic practices for determining new months and the difference between the Islamic and Gregorian calendars. Even the practice of seclusion, ittikaf, was reported on. Traditionally, remaining in the mosque during the last 10 days of Ramadan, particularly on the odd nights up the 20th of the month, is very praiseworthy. An acknowledgement of this practice prior to the end of the month of Ramadan in 1903 states, "A few days before it finished, some of the good living people, such as ministers and priests, shut themselves apart in the church and there said prayers, speaking to no one until the fasting season was finished." This is further elaborated on in 1912, explaining the last 10 days of the month are regarded as especially sacred. These Muhammad himself used to pass in retreat, and that it is in the course of them falls the night of decree or of power, but its exact date is not known. Despite the incorrect terminology, such as ministers, priests, and church, it is surprising that the practice of seclusion and the time it is predominantly practiced would be reported on within early Australian media. The prayer and the sermon of Eid celebrations have often received great attention. Within the early Australian print media, the entirety of the Eid proceedings are recorded. The opening takbir is mentioned such that a chant sung to a simple and solemn melody was the beginning of the service, and it continued for half an hour, the reporting of which was front page news. In 1884, a report describes the entire proceedings, stating, "The priest stood a yard from the rest and pronounced in a singing tone the word Allahu Akbar. Immediately this was done, the assemblage bowed reverently. The saying of prayers continued for a minute, the priest alone repeating there, when all fell on their knees and almost immediately afterwards prostrated themselves. The priest continued to the prayers, and the Mohammedans constantly bowed. The priest then retired from his place, and another man stepped forward, and standing in the stool, facing his auditors, read a half an hour in a sing-song tone selected passages from the Quran. After this was done, all joined together in prayer for about 2 minutes, and the ceremony ended. Service over, they embraced one another in true Mohammedan fashion. There is a particular art even to this, and several gentlemen holding high positions to India are adepts at it. They approach one another smiling and seizing the waist, bend over each other's left shoulder first, then right, wink over each shoulder, and then they release their hold and gaze affectionately at one another. Descriptions such as this, in varying length, can be found throughout the articles on the celebration of Eid in Australia's early print media. There are frequent instances of praise in such descriptions, such as in 1902, the prayers being performed with machine-like precision. and it being very evident that the orthodox follower of Muhammad is kept in fairly good training. Aside from the formal description of the prayer, some of the moral exhortations are also reported on. For instance, in 1897, after the prayers, the mullah read sacred passages from the Quran and gave an exhortation to those present to abide by their religion, to hold to their faith, and conduct themselves in such an orderly manner amongst the people they were living with. There are even instances when large sections of the exhortation, the khutbah, are reported verbatim. If reporting on men, predominantly of colour, dressed in cultural garb, reciting in non-English, and posturing in unison were not strange and exotic enough for the illiterate Caucasian public, then the news that such things were done completely sober was expressed as being astounding. Much to the surprise of the reporter, in 1900 they note that such celebrations are dry, for no intoxicating liquors, not even beer, are partaken of. And again in 1907, that in the evening they return home spotless and sedately cheerful. For no son of the only true prophet may touch juice of the grape. While expressed with a note of surprise, the reporting of this point of difference is done so that it highlights and reinforces Islamic orthopraxy. From the earliest reports of the celebration of Eid in Australia, there have always been mention of the non-Muslim spectators. In 1884, there were very few spectators at the time of the worship. There were very few spectators, as the time of the worship had not been made public, though this changed over time. In 1887, in one area, a small but curious crowd witnessed the function, while in Melbourne, a crowd of about 40 Europeans, including men, women, and boys, had appeared on the scene, watching the proceedings, with interest and occasional amusement, for those unaccustomed to Oriental ways. Over the years, the performance of the Eid prayers were often in the presence of an interested crowd of spectators. These crowds were most often respectful of the religious performance before them, with the honeybird ceased singing, and the circle of spectators, composed chiefly of women and children, was silent too. Over time, the Caucasian Australians were drawn not only to the spectacle of the celebrations and their curiosity, but also for their inclusion in aspects of the festivities. Reports in 1897 state an inexhaustible supply of nuts was provided, and visitors were welcome to as much meat as they desired. And the Europeans present were regaled with lemonade and fruit. Another in 1911 mentioned cases of oranges and mandarins were opened, and the fruit distributed, not only to Hindustanis, but also among onlookers. Again in 1913, the service having been truly gone through, cases of oranges were lifted out of the waiting vehicles, and the fruit distributed among both the coloured and the white persons present. Over time, the participation of the Caucasian Australians turned into expectation, with some of the boys asking one another weeks before, when are those blokes going to have their Christmas? For they well know the bountiful supply of lollies that accompanies it. Over time, anticipation of the celebrations, especially among the younger populace, increased, with reports admitting around the camping grounds, juveniles as thick as flies on tanglefoot awaited the conclusion of the ceremony, waiting, that is, for the tins of lollies to be carried from their hiding place before being distributed. It was acts of generosity to the wider community that Australian Muslims also actively partook in, with some in 1909 making a rush for 2 cases of apples which they had brought so they could fill the pockets of the visitors, and 2 of them had chased down tramcars in attempt to distribute these gifts. So, rather than the Eid prayers being hidden and confined to the mosque, they were often a public affair attended by onlookers. The celebrations often continued into the nights, with displays of dancing, music, and wrestling. This was much to the enjoyment of all present, for while the amusements were being held here, numbers of townspeople took advantage of the bright moonlit nights to walk down to the scene of the revels and enjoy the pleasing and humorous entertainment provided, and one and all received a cordial and friendly welcome. With a large crowd of people, principally Europeans, gathered at the reserve at the western end of Bailey Street to watch the Afghan dancing and indulging in wrestling bouts and other games, where Indian and Afghanistan sports were indulged in, and the visitors of European nationality to Faiz Muhammad's camp yesterday evening were warmly welcomed. And many Afghans, with the aid of sticks, were performing weird dances under the glare of flare lights to the music of a drum, an accordion, and a violin, and in the presence of about 200 spectators. In one instance, a sword dance in which Bahadur Khan handled a pair of blades very deftly brought the performance to an end. These celebrations had Australian Muslims entering into the whole proceedings with great spirit, regardless of the curious gape of the spectators. And while there seemed to be little tune to their singing, but there was in it a music of exultation, unbounded joy. Caucasian Australians were also more than mere spectators in the events, with an interesting wrestling match in the catch can style was provided between an Afghan and a European, the former, the smaller man, winning after a good display on both sides. From these reports, it is evidence that an awareness of the practices during the month of Ramadan and the celebration of Eid have been present amongst Australia's literate populace for more than 100 years, with there being a consistent inclusiveness in the Islamic celebration of Eid by the general Australian population. And we hope that as we proceed, a greater understanding of the history of Islam in Australia continues to deepen and widen, not only for the Ummah, but also for the greater Australian populace. Ramadan Mubarak.